How's everybody doing? It's been a fun week. It's been this past week we had like 3 new culture war arguments to have. I'm kind of just starting with a random thought of the day. We're gonna get to Michelle's pretty quickly. This one's pretty short. My random ass introduction, but yeah. What did we have this week? We had they're doing a Space Jam remake where they're redoing the look of Lola Bunny to be less sexualized. That's one. We have Mr. Potato Head becoming genderless or something. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but they're worried about the genderizing of Mr. Potato Head. And then 3 is, of course, Dr. Seuss, that people are saying Dr. Seuss is being canceled. What it really is the publisher who owns the rights, I believe, is choosing not to print like 6 Dr. Seuss titles anymore. And people then, to various degrees, attribute all this to cancel culture, or they attribute it to, they take sides in a culture war. Like, are you for redoing this to be more sensitive? Are you for not printing those racist Dr. Seuss books anymore? Or are you against? And it's all just, it's like, we're in the cycle of samsara, We're arguing about the same stupid cultural fault lines, arguing over those same fault lines that we have been for probably the better part of a decade now. And just we keep having the same argument over and over again. We keep chasing down the same thing. We get the same empty, unsatisfactory, hollow result out of it that doesn't, like I said, it doesn't satisfy us. We're always hungry for more. It's just a momentary fleeting distraction, and then you move on because you need another one and another one and another one. And that's what all of these little debates are. None of them are consequential to anything. It's not real politics. Or maybe it is. It's like politics is continually intersecting and becoming more and more enmeshed with culture every day. Or every year, it seems. It's like that our... not only is our politics more entertaining, but our entertainment is more political. And so as those things continue to intersect, all these little fights on social media that people can get into over mostly children's entertainment, or at least like man-child entertainment. It's not, we're not arguing over high art here. Sometimes a culture war thing pops up over that, right? But mostly we're talking about the Space Jam remake. Because, some people were seriously upset about that. But more than anything, I don't think, everyone frames it in the language of like, you're upset or you're offended. I don't know if that's what's happening, really. I think people are, more than anything, they're excited. Because it's another distraction to get in. I don't think they're actually like that angry. Or to the extent that they're angry in a way that's like entertaining to them. Like, they're angry in a way that you get angry over your sports team fucking up, or being at the game in an anime. Jesus, watching college football growing up, should have seen my parents. Like, I've never seen my father display such emotional peaks and troughs, highs and lows, as he did with how animated he would get at a Longhorns football game. Really, like verge of tears when they won the national championship in, I think it was 2005, where Vince Young ran this amazing fucking... Anyway, it's all sidetrack. People do get angry. They do get like upset, but it's not, when people think they're owning the libs or you mad bro or whatever. I think that's mostly a misunderstanding of what's going on, that people actually get very excited and they get very... at least I do. And I try to avoid culture war stuff now. But, it's like, ooh, a new argument. Who said one position, who said the opposite position? Oh, they clap back. Or it's like, they get into a team where they try to figure out, they try and sort the tribes out of like, okay, what side is my team on, of the people who culturally, that I psychologically identify with. And usually you can figure it out. Everyone has their own take. Usually people don't just parrot. They were able to give a nuanced take. I'm just saying, in my own experience on social media, my friends that I talk to on social media aren't probably that much different from anyone else's friends in America. It's not like occasionally you meet like a drooling fucking, just epitome of being a partisan hack who just says all the fucking woke shit, or they say all the fucking Pepe shit, and there's no nuance or anything interesting in what they say at all, and you already know everything they're going to say before they say it, yeah, you encounter those people. But I don't think those are the rule. I think that's the exception. I think most people as individuals will have their nuanced, peculiar, individualized takes on every issue, but more or less, they're an opportunity for you to figure out, where does my tribe sort out on this? Who do the people that I identify with, what are they going towards? And then it becomes a team sport, sort of. But it's not really, just like at one game is not that important. You move on to the next thing really quickly. And I don't know. Anytime, oftentimes people will try and optimize this for they've been beating up on the left all week about all this stupid canceling stuff. But what's interesting to me is how, we all know what happened to the anti-SJWs on YouTube, for example, right? Big zeitgeist in 2014, 2015, 2016, people calling out feminism, woke shit, cancel culture before we really called it cancel culture. And, oftentimes they had a point. It's like, okay, you just want to come in and divide people. You want to make everything political. You can't ever just enjoy something. We have to talk about how the song "It's Cold Outside" is sexist and rapey, and you can't just listen to the song and it's like, whatever. Maybe that's a valid criticism. Maybe it's not. It doesn't matter. The people who criticized the SJW movement became the anti-SJWs. That became a whole clique and its own cultural counter movement on YouTube and on the internet and in social media and elsewhere. The people saying, fuck your PC culture, defining themselves by saying, I'm against all that. And they became just as hyper-focused on the same set of issues and just as reflexively dismissive and hostile to things that fell on the woke or SJW side that they didn't like. And it's just, you can't extricate yourself from cancel culture by calling out cancel culture, because what are you doing? You're trying to cancel culture. You don't, this is what people don't understand, because I've seen everything framed under the language of canceling. Like Dr. Seuss, the publisher deciding not to print its own titles that it's owned is them canceling all of Dr. Seuss. I mean, again, I just presented a very, oh shit, my book just fell. A very rigid, unnuanced version of that. But, that I have seen, however people qualify it or whatever conversations I've seen, basically one side of the argument is that Dr. Seuss is being, in some capacity, canceled. Same language for what was another thing recently? I mean, there was a ridiculous incident where this one conservative commentator on YouTube copped to accidentally using dog shampoo. He was took a picture of the shampoo bottle he'd been using. And he said, I've been using the shampoo for months. It just says shampoo. It doesn't say dog shampoo. How am I supposed to know it's for dogs? I feel dumb. And people told him, hey man, there's a picture of a dog on the shampoo bottle. And he basically made fun of him. You should have known better. And he was invited onto Fox News to talk about how he was being canceled by the woke left because they were taking the piss out of him for this. It's like, no, dude, they're just making fun of you because you fucking copped to using dog shampoo for a month or however long you used it for. And so it's they're just there's this now knee-jerk tendency to talk about everything they're canceling me. They're canceling this, they're canceling that. And then you have the anti-cancellation people who come up. But what is it all? It's just people yelling at each other, but mostly entertaining themselves with the temporary distraction of a little culture war fight to have. And even this, what I'm doing right now, where I'm talking about both sides, plenty of people do that. That doesn't end the cancel culture either. Do you see what I'm saying here? The only thing I'm trying to get across is just being aware of the fact that no amount of calling something out or going and giving your take on something, telling a bunch of people where they're wrong, and just going and posting about shit, being a poster for or against any issue, doesn't ever, that you're still within that same framework, the same Karenist framework of cancel culture, anti-cancel culture, calling people out for the calling them out, calling people out because they don't understand that by calling people out for calling people out, they're still calling people out. You're all still in the cycle. And so I would just say, as an addendum to that, there's almost nothing sadder than somebody who is like a nuance bro who posts on Facebook or whatever. Let me give you my take on why both sides are wrong, and it's somewhere in the middle. Let's see beyond this cancel culture thing. That it's like like nobody's thought about that maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle, and I think this whole argument's stupid and I abstain from it. Posting that publicly, that's really what I'm saying is the sad thing. Discussion, I guess, can always be fun. It can always be good. And like I said, we're all just trying to get entertained. We're not, if you don't mistake it for anything other than that, whatever. I'm just saying, when somebody contributes a post to social media, which is becoming part of the discussion, to say, I abstain from this whole discussion because it's stupid, and therefore, at least ostensibly, they're saying you're all stupid for having it, but I'm above it. It doesn't escape from that same fundamental thing of just calling people out, because it ends up being another form of call out. And so, we'll never end cancel culture by people going online and getting angry about it, because that's just trying to cancel culture, and you can't do it. You can't end it by those means. You can do it by getting off your fucking computer. And maybe the fact that I know all this and I'm disseminating it is also part of a problem, right? And so it's like, that's the dynamics of this thing. The unfortunate reality is the best way to communicate to people who care about this and talk about these issues is still online, and it's still like, so it's a quandary. But everyone's heard about it that I talked to in real life. So people aren't logging off. They do know. And, these very inane culture war issues that are going to seem dated. This is going to date this video severely, but that's fine, because what this whole segment is about is not really any one of those individual issues. It's consider this a little fossil record of the inane shit that we argued over. Almost, I'm glad I'm making this video as an artifact of the three bogus things, Dr. Seuss, Mr. Potato Head, and Space Jam, that we all argued about online, or at least some non-trivial number of people got outraged about online in the first week of March in 2021. And you could take that for any number of things. Maybe that's people wanting to go back to sleep politically. And so that's the most, even as superficial as it is, that's the most political engagement they can fucking muster, is culture war stuff. Pure politics as entertainment. Or you could take it as we've all been locked down too long, and this pandemic is driving us crazy. We'll do anything for entertainment. We'll argue over anything. We're just scrolling on their phone all the time, and they want something like that. That is the secret, too. We do all this stuff because we want to fucking do it, right? We can talk about the adverse, effects of you on social media, but we want to do this stuff, because it's fun. It's fun for people. It's the new entertainment. We've all been given these devices, and this is how we choose to use them. And that tells you something about human beings. Now, you can take whatever you will from that, of what your solution is. So we're going to move on to Michelle's part 5. Attempts to restrict the influence of the leaders. Well, we've been talking about this whole time with Robert Michelle's. You know it all by now. How organization is required for democracy, for the masses to gain power, but organization creates leadership. It creates divergent interests for leadership. It turns the leaders into a different class of person. And thus, oligarchy seems to be inevitable, or at least it's a force that's constantly exerting itself on even the most democratic or indeed socialist political parties. And so political parties as a text is a whole exploration of why all the social forces and structural forces that create oligarchical cliques within political parties. and insulate. What that means is to insulate the leaders from the will of the people, to entrench them in a power structure, because every power structure tries to entrench and preserve itself, against forces, internal or external, that would displace that power structure. And that happens in the most egalitarian of political movements. So, part 5 in this book, and we're in the second to last part, and this is going to be the second to last video because these parts are shorter than some of the other parts, or at least I feel like we can breeze through a lot of this because a lot of the complicated groundwork for understanding how Michel's, why Michel, the main core of the argument's been made. Part 5 attempts to restrict the influence of leaders is Michel's talking about the specifically democratic countermeasures that you could take against oligarchy. Because we've been looking at all these things that create leaders that have power that's insulated from the masses. What are these measures or things or forces that oppose that? What are the democratic forces that are, you have the oligarchical forces that are building this edifice of oligarchy, an organization. What are the democratic forces that can dissolve that? And that's what part 5 is about. And it's broken down into 4 chapters. He talks about the referendum. He talks about the idea of renunciation. Draws heavily on Bakunin there. He talks about, syndicalism, and then anarchism. And I have to admit, I was thinking about a lot of these as I read through the text. Because the referendum is the obvious bulwark against autocratic power. And the arguments that he makes against direct popular democracy, I think they in general hold up. And he presents some important reasons why there will always be an oligarchy, even if you do as many things as you can through direct popular referendum. But some of his critiques were a little outdated. And here, I don't know if it works either, because some of the practical issues that he raises may not be practical issues anymore. But, just to... We'll put it this way. Even if you have the people directly legislating what the policies will be, you still need a body to enforce said policies. And that requires organization and therefore leadership to direct that enforcement. It's executive branch that we have in the American government. And so even if you were to have, for example, no Congress or Senate, let's just take the American system, no Congress or Senate, everything's direct democracy on state level and federal level. We now have the technology where we could reasonably do that. You could have, there may come a time soon where we can have blockchain voting. You could vote from your phone. Maybe not quite there yet, but even with all the doing voting all in person, you could reasonably do it. We're not waiting for people to show up by horse-drawn carriage anymore, and we have the infrastructure in place that we've done. We do every presidential election by direct election. You could do plenty of things by direct ballot referendum. But then you still need, you would need, if you do it on the state or local level, if you all vote to have, let's say, some sort of social welfare program, you're going to give, let's say, food to the poor. Okay, you need to now organize a body of people to do that. Well, what does that require? It doesn't just require the material and the manpower. You have to have management. You have to have some sort of people to administer over that and make sure that, people aren't like embezzling, or you have to make business decisions. It's just the practical realities then, the more things you understand that need to be done in order for governance to happen, requires all sorts of specialized people and bureaucrats and bureaucracies and institutions. And you can't You can't do everything by ballot initiative because that's just the theory. You need a body to put it into practice, and that body will have to be organized, and that's not, you can't just conscript everyone to do everything because that's never going to work. So how do you enforce that? For one, everyone enforces it on everyone else. It's like that. It doesn't make any sense. So, what do we, and we'll just talk about one of the things that he says here at the end of this chapter. The power of Bonapartism was in fact based on the referendum. This is page 310. The institution of the referendum demands for its just working a perfectly conscientious bureaucracy, for the history of this electoral system shows with what ease its results are falsified. Even if the operation should be effected strictly according to the rule, the result of a referendum can never have a truly demonstrative value, for it always lacks the vivifying influence of discussion. To conclude, it may be said that it can exercise no substantial influence upon the executive. And what he means by that is, it's Michael Parenti's theory that when change threatens to rule, then the rules are changed. And he gives a few examples that when the party leadership, I won't go into them. It's basically just party leadership in a couple of these socialist parties across Europe decided to hold a vote on something, and then when it became clear that the rank and file of the party was going to go against what the leadership wanted, they either falsified the results, or they canceled the referendum, or they they overruled it in some way, which we see plenty of times in modern party politics in America, where the parties, as we all know, and I've discussed in past videos, but we'll say again, are private entities that, while they have some regulation on them, can mostly do as they please, and that can involve being completely undemocratic with their selection of candidates. And like the big example is superdelegates in the 2016 election, that you have party officials whose votes are worth, many votes of the people, and they're allowed to more or less just control the election regardless of the popular vote. And so you can always do that if a vote threatens to change things that you are unwilling to compromise on as party leadership. And so I think that's mostly right. I think the referendum, in theory, I think within a system, you can allow for the possibility that on certain issues, the governing power will leave that decision up to the people. But that is always the decision of the ruling power to do that, because they're the ones who are going to enforce it. And I should bring up, if we're talking about this right now, if we want to talk about something substantively political that's happening in the news, we have many state legislatures in the wake of the 2020 election mulling over the idea of greatly restricting the power of the ballot initiative. And so it's actually I didn't even think about that till just now, but that's a great case in point for what Michelle's is talking about. I believe it was in Arizona, they want to raise it from, like a 50% simple majority to up to 60% or 2/3 to do major reforms. And this is because a lot of these, and it was conservatives, by the way, which that's not entirely out of keeping with the conservative ideology, that more or less the power of the democracy should be limited, because you shouldn't have the government just be an apparatus, just a tool for the masses, the majority, to use to impose the tyranny of the majority, that they believe we should be ruled by laws and not men, which I consider absurd, but that's why they worship the Constitution the way they do. And so the idea, it's like that's why they hold this ancient document up above whatever the popular will might be, because that's actually their philosophy is anti-majoritarian and pro-Republican, big R, or maybe it's smaller, but Republican in the sense of believing in a republic. And so, when they see things like Oregon legalizing even psychedelics and opioids, or, tons of states legalizing marijuana, that's one a lot of the moralist conservatives really don't like. Any number of things. Florida raised their minimum wage $15 an hour. Florida went for Donald Trump. Still. I mean, it's generally considered a purple state. It's probably going to be a red state in the future, given the trends. And they still voted for a minimum wage increase by direct ballot initiative, because even though they're generally going in a conservative direction, it's like there's still a class interest in raising the wages of the workers who've been completely fucked over the past 40 years, 50 years. And it's just getting worse and worse since 2008 and now with this pandemic. So why wouldn't they vote that to themselves? And the people in charge represent typically business interests or the financial sector or the professional managerial class, and they don't want that. So, and the drug thing, I think that's kind of like an older power structure of prison industrial complex. I think everyone who's being intellectually honest recognizes the drug war for what it is at this point. Just a complete failure. It's rather embarrassing, actually. But it's created this state of affairs that, you just can't rip out the prison industrial complex out of the American heartland. You're ripping the guts out of a lot of communities and a lot of the, there's whole towns that their existence is premised on the existence of a prison there. Their economic existence is premised on that. And so, not to mention private prison contracts and things of that nature. And what the drug war allows the police to do and our intelligence agencies to do, what license it gives them. And so I think everyone realizes the drug war was a mistake, but there's important reasons why a lot of people don't want to undo that mistake. Incentives why they don't want to undo that mistake. I think the cat's trying to get in, but I'm not going to let him in. Because he can be really loud and, hog all the attention. So chapter 2, the postulate of renunciation. What he's talking about here, so he quotes Nechayev. Nechayev. He wrote his famous revolutionary catechism enunciating the principle that the true revolutionary must be a man, quote, consecrated to the cause. In the first paragraph we read, quote, he has neither personal interests nor affairs, neither feelings, attachments, nor propriety, not even a name. Everything in him is absorbed in a single exclusive interest, one thought, one passion, the revolution. End quote. The aim was to attain to an absolute forgetfulness of the former bourgeois existence. So, what we're talking about in the last chapter, the embourgeoisement of the party. Michels points out, and I agree with him, it's a natural part of the socialist parties. I don't know if I read this last time, but the way that chapter ends, this is on page 304 in the previous chapter, a political labor movement without deserters from the bourgeoisie is historically as inconceivable as would be such a movement without a class-conscious proletariat. This consideration applies above all to the early days of the labor movement, but it is still applicable to the movement in the form which we know it today, and obviously it's applicable in the form that we know it today, because, again, it's in the learned that the theories of socialism even survive at all. And popular labor movements have more or less been disassembled in America over the past number of years. Again, past 40 or 50 years. And so a lot of the modern labor movement is driven by people who are bourgeois deserters. They're what Peter Turchin would call, they were aspirant elites to the professional managerial class who didn't make it. And, washed out and became socialists or revolutionaries or radicals or whatever the case may be. And he points out why those people will always be there. Because it's the role of the bourgeois to instruct the proletarians of their own oppression, because they're the people who realize the system of oppression, gaining some education. And even if they're of proletarian origin, when people become leaders of the labor movement or they become educated, they become declassed, and there's just always this bourgeois element. And you need it because you need intellectuals to deal with scientific or legal questions. For example, there are practical realities. To get into the Chinese philosophy a little bit, it's a yin-yang. That's if the organized labor movement is within the white paisley of the yin-yang, the bourgeois leadership and intellectual element is that little black dot. And funnily enough, I forget the term in Chinese, but in yin-yang modes of thought, what they talk about is the idea of when things reach their extreme, reach their limit, the opposite is then sort of provoked by that very thing. It's maybe a little metaphysical, but it's the idea that, and also that your own, the opposition, your own contradictions to whatever it is that your beliefs and goals and structure of power is, will emerge from within you, from your own. That it'll be a contradiction that will emerge from within your own ranks or within your own mind or whatever the case may be. So, like the bourgeois, that's the element within the party that arguably has now overtaken the working class movement and turned all these political parties into more conservative parties that serve the current liberal social order. So what Nedjajev is talking about there is this idea of how do we get not just because he's not just talking about the bourgeois elements, but he is talking about them. This mindset that's purely revolutionary, just burning with the passion of revolution. And it involves renounce everything in the world, renounce all these bourgeois comforts. What is it? Bakunin, this is on page 315. Michels writes, Bakunin spoke of such déclassement not as a historical fact, but as a psychological postulate of the effective socialist action of those who were not proletarians by birth. Thus, in Bakunin's view, the déclassé was not a social outcast, a bankrupt, an ineffectual genius, in a word, an involuntary outcast, but the very opposite, a voluntary outcast, one who has deliberately broken with the society in which he was born, in order to adapt himself to a strange environment, and one hostile to that in which he was himself brought up. He is an intentional déclassé, and apart from the end which he pursues, he must inspire us with respect for his spirit of self-sacrifice. And he basically argued that they should have, if somebody were to abandon the bourgeois to become part of a political party, they must also abandon all of the luxury, all of the status, all of the trappings, all of the privileges of their power, and live as laborers. And in fact, they should work as laborers if possible. They should become indistinguishable from the rest of the members of the party. They should be made to dress plainly and, required to contribute manual work and all these things. You must have them renounce their former lifestyle if the old bourgeois ideas are to leave their head. This idea that your power structure and your culture and your social class are inculcated in you by your very upbringing, and you can't just declass by choice, by an act of will. You have to change your environmental way of life. I think I have a complicated position on this because I think that's Bakunin's position is basically right. That I would believe that for the same reason that like William James or like Carl Jung or a lot of like pragmatic thinkers and psychologists have often really emphasized and stressed that things like virtue are a function of like daily habits and a million inconsequential or seemingly apparently inconsequential decisions, but which are actually all tiny little junctions that can push you in one way or the other. If the individual in your life and the direction of your life is a ship, that they're all like, a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a degree shift in one direction or the other. And that things like your daily environment and your daily habits and your daily activity and routine and all those seemingly unimportant, seemingly insignificant things you do every day are far more important than any high-flying, beliefs or religious experience or awakening or, even though William James wrote varieties of religious experience. I'm largely getting this from him. But that it's the everyday, it's the mundane that's more important. It's the external factors and conditions you find yourself in and the routine that you're in. That's what reshapes you as a person over time very gradually. And so you can't have an epiphany that socialism is correct and then go on living a bourgeois lifestyle where you still have all these bourgeois class interests and privileges and incentives for things never to change for you. Because deep down, you won't really want them to change. Or it's almost evidence that you don't really want them to change if you're not actively changing it in your own life. And so I think Bakunin is correct that you only inspire that sense of humility and actually becoming a proletarian by living like one. That being said, what Michels concludes the chapter by saying on page 316 is, in our own day, the principle that the leaders should practice economic renunciation and should identify themselves with the multitude is advocated only by a few thousand isolated romanticists who belong to the anarchist wing of the socialist movement, and even by them only in timid peripheries. Sorry. It's a brain fart. Further down on the page, he concludes the chapter by saying, it is obvious that these attempts, which are inefficacious and impractical, can succeed at most in creating party fanaticism. They cannot establish identity of thought and action between the leaders and the proletarian masses. I think that's correct. Like, that ultimately it becomes a sort of performance. It's an inspiration to party fanaticism. I mean, think of the Maoists here, Maoist China, and all of the presentation of the leaders of communist China, how they dressed, the hat and the plain gray outfits of a working revolutionary. The lack of pretension becomes a pretense, right? And ultimately, what does that do? I mean, there were still, what he means in a very important sense, that doesn't actually align their interests with that of the working class. Because ultimately, it's the power and the fact that they're the ones holding the power that makes those interests diverge. And that, as we're coming closer and closer to the end of the novel, it becomes very clear that, because you could kind of go back and forth on whether Michels thinks this is really an iron law or whether it's really inevitable. But he does use the term iron law at the end. And as uncomfortable as I am with that term, there's a million extenuating circumstances and reasons why every scenario could be different, and there could be all sorts of unforeseen things. Granted. But the principle itself, that power, makes you conservative just by the fact that you hold power and status. You would like things to stay that way then. And that being a very basic fact about human nature seems rather inescapable, doesn't it? I mean, again, there could be exceptions in reality or specific circumstances that would complicate matters. But more or less, it's like you get to the dark beating heart of the history of political parties, and that I think that really is it. That maybe it really is. I mean, I guess I'm just saying power corrupts, right? Which is something I've said I disagree with. But man, does Michels make a powerful argument for it. And I mean, if you're conservative, you might not say that it corrupts. But if your goal is egalitarian democracy, then yeah, it corrupts. Because you will be alienated by the very holding of power. You become alienated from the mass, the powerless mass. And you making the pretense that you are simply one of them, even if you go to large extents in your lifestyle to do that, I mean, hell, even emperors and kings did that. I remember it was the Buddhist emperor who, in China, he was an emperor of the Southern Dynasty, so it was a time when basically the steppe tribes had taken over and kicked the Han Chinese out of their own heartland, and they had relocated to, I forget the ancient name of it, but it's basically where Nanchang is now. No, it can't be Nanchang. It's going to be further south. Not important, but I remember reading about this emperor. I believe it was Emperor Wen of the Lusong. I could be totally wrong. But, the descriptions of how he would only wear these, rough fabrics and, only eat, a monk's meal, just some rice and, maybe a few vegetables once a day, and he meditated and kept to all these routines of hygiene and, refused the fine silks and all of the excesses of nobility. He was still the emperor, though, and he was living in a different fucking world than the average Chinese peasant would have been. And I suppose what I'm saying is you can have those virtues, and they could even be legitimate virtues. But where the pretense comes in is in thinking that that actually brings you closer to the interests and the moral reality of the people, because it doesn't. So, chapter 3, Syndicalism. Basically, Michel's talks about the idea that, okay, what if political parties are fundamentally, there's no electoralist strategy where we can achieve socialism. So maybe syndicates are the way. Trade unions. Keep it as a labor movement. This is a theory I am sympathetic to as well, because I basically have come to believe, not just from this book, actually long before reading this book, but this book reinforced a lot of those ideas in me, that an electoralist strategy for any kind of political change is pretty foolish. I believe I mostly concluded the last video saying that a third party is more viable than working through any of these existing parties, because it seems like they become more corrupt and oligarchical over time. But here Michel says even the trade union, even the syndicate, has its problems. On page 318, the great significance of syndicalism is found, above all, in the clear and penetrating manner in which it has recognized the dangers of bourgeois democracy. With a genuinely scientific skepticism, it has stripped away the veils which conceal the power exercised by the democracy and the state, showing that this power is really no more than the hegemony of a minority, and demonstrating that it is in acute opposition with the needs of the working class. Democracy intends to continue the exploitation of the producing masses by an oligarchy of professionals from the intelligentsia. And that's Michel's quoting George Sorel there. That's really quite amazing to me. It's like we're just now really, I feel, seeing a large number of people comprehend, even if they wouldn't have the language to say it or talk about it, that we're ruled by an oligarchy of professionals from the intelligentsia. That's never been more true than it is now. The professional managerial class is the ruler of the world. In like every country, almost every country. And so he first brings up sort of this chapter is called Syndicalism as a prophylactic. The legitimate criticism there of the party and the idea that the trade union is the way to go. Page 319, he says the organic structure of the trade unions is based upon the same foundation as that of the political party of the workers, namely the representation of the interests of the rank and file by individuals specially elected for that purpose. In the decisive moments of the struggle for higher wages, the masses do not represent themselves, but are represented by others. Trade unions without representatives, without some kind of executive, do not exist and are inconceivable. So there we have it again. I mean, the trade union has its advantages in that it is directly materially related to the actual conditions of people's work in everyday life. And so the problems are very tangible. They are less abstract. It is more insulated from culture war bullshit, like the shit that we talked about at the beginning of this. Those affairs need not come up. They shouldn't come up, and you shouldn't comment on them, like as a trade union official. Whereas we almost expect all of our politicians. Oh, the cat's all made it in here. You hiss at me, you motherfucker. The cat made me lose my train of thought. This is why I didn't want to let him fucking in here. If I don't put you on camera, people are going to be mad at me. Come here. Come get on camera. Oh, man. You can hear him probably now. Oh, man. Oh, yes. This is DeForest Kelly. Oh, he's gone. He didn't like that. Okay. But, okay. Problem rears its ugly head again. You need an executive organ. You need functionaries. You need representatives. And if you've seen all the previous videos on this, if you've been following up until now, you know why that causes these same oligarchic forces to reassert themselves. And as he says, if you try to take away that element of having an executive or a representative of some kind, he's like fucking with this box over here, then that's inconceivable. That's never happened, and it's a dream. It's as fantastical as the concept that he discussed at the end of the last part of, let's just get rid of the intellectuals. You know, people like Pol Pot took that to the extreme of blaming the intellectuals for all of the failed revolutions that had happened. You know, and we could argue of how much Pol Pot was really a socialist or how much he believed any of that. But, you know, and I'm not saying that was a typical idea among socialists. He just took that, like, I guess what I'm saying is even within that, like, the craziness of, you know, the stories everyone knows of the Khmer Rouge going into the big cities and saying, well, you wear glasses, you must be an intellectual, and therefore you have to be killed, or you're an artist, you must be killed, or creative. Anyone who remembers the past or, you know, has any level of education above an illiterate peasant has to be eliminated so that we can reshape this whole country. That idea that you need to clear away the intellectuals to have a truly blank slate, we can see the seed, the kernel of truth in that idea, as awful as the results of the Khmer Rouge purges were, that genocide was, because there is that kernel of truth that the intellectuals are a problem, but you can't get rid of them any more than the trade union can get rid of its leaders. You can't have a system where you're not represented, and that creates a situation like we talked about before, when the German Socialist Party reserves for its leaders the right to strike, or the German trade unions reserve for their leaders the right to strike, and will fight with their own rank and file and tell them, no, you're wrong to strike. You can't do that. You know, and we saw that, I think I brought this up before, post-revolution, a lot of communist countries, all the trade unions became run by governments, answering directly to the communist parties and the various politburos. And so all the strikes that happen are wildcat strikes, because those leaders are never going to direct their members to strike. And so it's like by integrating all that, these communist regimes effectively neutered the trade union movement. And so, it's a natural oligarchic force. So the end of this chapter, page 324, he drives it home here. The more syndicalism gathers power, the more conspicuous among the syndicalists become the effects which are everywhere characteristic of the representative system. From the ranks of the French syndicalists, leaders have already sprung whose sensitiveness towards the criticisms of their followers can be equaled only by that of an English trade union leader. Youthful syndicalism, although born out of an opposition to the authoritarianism of the leaders, is thus quite unable to escape the oligarchical tendencies which arise in every organization. For the syndicalist leaders, as for others, the preservation of their own power becomes the supreme law. So far has the process already gone in France, that they have abandoned the old tactics of taking advantage of the prosecutions instituted against them by the government to make propagandist speeches in court and to employ the language of heroes and prophets. Instead, on these occasions, they act with extreme prudence and display diplomatic reserve. Sorel himself speaks of the, quote, progressive degeneration of trade unionism, and he has declared, quote, the General Confederation of Workers takes on more and more the aspect of government employee. And so now we come to the last chapter of this section, chapter 4, Anarchism is Prophylactic. Now, I have a very negative view of anarchism. I didn't always. I didn't always have like a hostility to it, which I do now. I used to just think, like, I always thought it was unrealistic. I was never a fan of anarchism. And I've been exposed to both left-wing and right-wing anarchism, and I've gotten intellectually to the edge, to both of those edges, to sort of peer off the edge of like what lays down this path. And, so it's like Bakunin on one side, and you have your, what would be the other side, the Randian, Murray Rothbard, von Mises side. Or I guess Kropotkin, bread guy, is on the left-wing side as well. Shut this door. This cat's making noise. Yeah, I'm probably just going to take a picture. I'll take like the screenshot of like when it's just him, when I'm like holding him or whatever, and make that the video tab, because then people will say there's a cat in it, even though he's been nothing but a problem. I'm sure some people are like watching this and like, I want more of that cat. This has been the most interesting thing that happened in the video. So, and he mentions, Peter Kropotkin. We'll just sort of talk about his critique of anarchism and his characterization of anarchism to wrap up this video, as this is the last section. So page 326, he says, the theoretical struggle against all authority, against all coercion, to which many of the most eminent anarchists have sacrificed a large portion of their lives, has not stifled them the natural love of power. A bit further down, he says, quote, these are the means utilized by the apostle and the orator, the flaming power of thought, greatness of self-sacrifice, profundity of conviction. Their dominion is exercised not over the organization, but over minds. It is the outcome, not of technical indispensability, but of intellectual ascendancy and moral superiority. And he says that the means of dominion employed by the anarchist leader belong to an epoch which political parties have already outlived. And so what he's saying there, the leaders of the party survive by technical indispensability, by climbing the meritocratic, bureaucratic hierarchy, being the best at some technical function within the party, becoming a functionary. The party is about, it's an actual structure of power that needs to be managed by professionals. And that is, political parties were part of the zeitgeist across all of liberal society, and indeed really across the world, following sort of ascension of the neoliberal world trading order. That's where the power is. That's been ushered in. And so the anarchist as a orator and someone who is like a font of moral superiority kind of belongs to a bygone age. He's like a prophet or a priest or someone giving a speech before a great battle. And those are the main weapons that the anarchist has at his disposal. And they're powerful because he can win hearts and minds, and ideas can survive, obviously, across long generations, even outside of any kind of power structure. But they're still outside of the power structure. So, and I know it's like, that's almost a very like basic bitch kind of critique of anarchism. I don't think anyone's overcome it. It's like we can argue about ends justify the means all day long, but if your means are completely impotent, if your means involve completely ceding any power that you may have had to alter the world or alter the political reality, just abstaining from doing anything, that's a huge problem, and it's a fatal problem. You can't overcome it. So yeah, this is sort of my commentary. Although the moral superiority thing, I mean, I think I may have said this before, but I need to stop saying I may have said this before, because I'm going to say a lot of things that I've said before, and you just need to fucking get used to it. Part of why the Democrats get so pissed off at people like Bernie and progressives in general, and people who criticize them from the left, is they don't really like the idea that there is a left to them. And part of it's because, if we accept what Michelle's has said here, there are incentives and forces working on them, some sometimes, or even probably mostly unconsciously, that have reshaped them and made them more conservative, but they still think of themselves as progressive, devoted to the progressive cause. They just have to achieve it by working within the system, working within the bureaucracy, following the rules, and all of that is stifling and makes you an incrementalist and a gradualist and a not a radical. And so what does that mean? I mean, if you say, I want people out of the ICE detention camps. Let's say you think the ICE immigration detention camps are a huge moral abomination. And there's somebody in office who's like, I'm doing everything I can within the system. We're going to hold votes, and I have a committee assignment on it. And I think I'll be able to reduce the population of people being held in these ICE detention camps by at least, 15% this year. And then you have the anarchist who's not part of any formal political system who simply says, well, I'm for the morally right thing to do is tear down those camps and let those people go free right now. Obviously, if you believe that that's a moral abomination, who's morally superior? Obviously, it's the anarchist. So they will always be morally superior to the people in power by the people. I'm saying this as within the internal moral universe of the people in power, insofar as they do come from a progressive movement, right? And so naturally, they will hate the progressive because that's the sting of their conscience, and nobody wants to fucking hear that. And they will always respond to them, probably in the language we're talking about now. Fuck you, what have you done? That's one of the things Saul Alinsky said. There's like an old black and white footage of him talking to a protester, and he said, well, I would put it to you that I'm more radical than you because I actually do things that change the world to achieve our agenda. And so that's the Alinskyite argument for why you should work within the system and become more conservative, functionally more conservative, because you need that power to bring forth that change. So, yeah. Page 326 again. Quote, not even Bakunin proposed to exclude the principles of organization and discipline, but he desired that they should be voluntary instead of automatic. He conceived the anarchist regime as a federation of perpetual barricades and proposed to institute a council of the revolutionary commune consisting of delegates, 1 or 2 in number from each barricade, or from each street or quarter, these delegates having an imperative mandate. The communal council thus composed would nominate from among its own members special executive committees for all the branches of the revolutionary administration of the commune. So that's Bakunin's system. But he says on page 327, as Marx justly pointed out, these executive committees, if they were to do anything at all, must be furnished with powers and must be sustained by public force. The federal parliament would have no reason for existence unless it were to organize this public force. Besides, this parliament could, just like the communal council, delegate its executive power to 1 or more committees, and each of these would in fact be invested with an authoritative character which the needs of the struggle would not fail continually to accentuate. In a word, according to Marx, the whole Bakuninian scheme would be characterized by an ultra-authoritative stamp. I agree. I agree with Marx's critique of Bakunin. What is it? We have Ostrogorsky, page 328, has proposed to substitute for party organization, which invariably leads to the institution of anti-democratic forms. And see, a lot of people notice this, and not just Michel's, but I think he's the only one to have written a book just solely on this topic. Continue with Michel's. So Ostrogorsky suggested a system of temporary associations, which should come into existence only for the attainment of definite ends, and should be dissolved as soon as these ends have been secured. He considers that the adoption of this system would tend to restore to political struggles the sincerity, honesty, and clarity which they lack today. Now the analysis of political parties which has been effected authorizes us to doubt the efficiency of the proposed method. Its adoption would not secure any real progress, even if it were possible to suppress by a simple decree the organizations which have been brought into existence by the necessary determinants of historical evolution. So, you're going to decree that we will form this committee with powers, because, if it doesn't have power to do anything, it doesn't matter what fucking committee you form. But, we'll have a system of temporary associations will come into existence to deal with this problem, and then we'll dissolve it. Why would it dissolve? Is basically the Michel's critique here. Why would it dissolve? Because the law says it has to. Who's enforcing that? Well, there's no one to enforce it. It's the very body that's tasked with enforcement. We have no examples of that existing where, not just someone, I'm not talking about just, Cincinnatus becomes dictator and then he steps down and goes back to his farm. There was still a whole Roman government. We're talking about the whole government saying, all right, we're done now. The government's work is done. We can retire to our farms. You can't, there's no one to enforce that order, and so the government will persist. Or if you do leave and cede all your powers, another government will move in. You will be gobbled up by the state of nature. Because in the geopolitical world, not within states, but governing the relations between states, still in the state of nature. You'll have ceded organization, power, the ability to defend yourself. So anyway, he's just saying, look, that's not practical and that's never happened. It's pie in the sky. So this is the conclusion of the chapter. Whilst anarchism, which presents to us the most abstract and most idealistic vision of the future, has promised to the world an order from which all concentration of power shall be excluded, it has not known how to establish as part of anarchist theory the logical elements of such an order. That's the end. That's the end before we get into part 6. So the final few chapters of Michel's final considerations, and we'll just sort of wrap up and talk about the book then. And maybe I'll try and do a stream with some other people, either on that video or on another video, to just talk about Michel's political parties and the iron law of oligarchy. But I don't think the issue is settled by this chapter. I think what Michel's lays out there. So there's the idea of you hold referendums, you do as much as you can by direct popular vote. That could be a tool in your arsenal, like I said. Within a system, you could have that to make it more democratic. Renunciation, you could demand that the leaders live, that's like a very, very Platonic or Socratic or even Spartan sort of, demand on the leadership that they be these ultra virtuous people and take an oath to live a very certain kind of lifestyle. Doesn't seem practical. Hardly anyone's advocating for it. And unfortunately, that depends just on the virtue of your leaders, which, good luck. And then, of course, anarchism and syndicalism, which to me seem like total non-starters. Syndicalism, if the trade union or the syndicate or the union or whatever, some labor organization, co-op, whatever it might be, becomes the primary means of workers gaining power and organizing, their leaders will be subject to the same pressures. So I think that's a non-starter. I think anarchism is a non-starter because there's no route from here to anarchism, because there's no, change requires the power to make that change, and anarchists don't have any, and they will never have any so long as they stick to the position of anarchism. And in a way, anarchism, it's like the extreme of the egalitarian socialist ideal. Some people, like Matt Christman, calls it the extreme of liberalism. I think it's kind of both. It's extreme individualism, yes, but I think especially left-wing anarchists are not really thinking about it in those terms. They're thinking about it in terms of, okay, the problem is power structures. They're kind of perceiving, whether they've read Michel's or any of these people or not, they're perceiving on some level, the problem is just power. Power makes you conservative. It makes you want to preserve the status quo to your own advantage. If you're the minority benefiting while the majority toils, why would you change that situation? But you need to have some kind of power to affect any kind of change. And so that's the more you accrue the power, the more you violate the principles of anarchism, which makes it's like anarchism, the problem of ever realizing anarchism without violating the very principles of anarchism. That internal contradiction between the ends and the means, that's the whole story of what Michel's is talking about with political parties. All right. Well, that's all.